Chapter 8. The Officer. Richard stared at the luthier with his fists still clenched and his jaw set tight. He dug his fingernails into the palms of his hands and fought to maintain control. But it was no use. He choked up as soon as he thought about Michelle. "I'm not putting up with this, and I'm not putting up with you," Richard yelled. The luthier calmly stirred his varnish while Richard stormed back to the violin shop, grabbed his Bergonzi, and threw open the Blazer's door. He revved the engine and dropped it into gear, then roared off through the orchard with rocks flying out from underneath the spinning tires. "Who does this guy think he is?" fumed Richard while driving back toward the old highway. "I wonder what Sam will have to say when I tell him that the blank violin maker burned up his check." With his jaw set tight and an iron grip on the steering wheel, Richard pulled back onto the pavement and gave it more gas. He was tired of the charade and ready for the respect and courtesy he knew was waiting for him in New York. He was sure of his decision and set his sights on Manhattan, then drove back down Main Street a bit faster than he had come up it. He had been able to push Michelle to the back of his mind until the prospect of buying a new violin had come up. Now he found himself thinking about her almost constantly. He had been able to manage just fine, living alone and taking care of himself. He could put up with his life and career just the way it was. But he couldn't put up with the grief and the torment again. Richard pounded his fist on the dashboard. Tears were welling in his eyes. No, he was going to New York, buying the Guarnerius and getting back to his life just the way he had planned before talking with Samuel. When Richard reached the south end of town, flashing blue and red lights caught his attention in the rearview mirror. "Oh, blank, blank, and blank," he yelled after looking at the speedometer. Richard was going faster, but 60 in a 35 was what he signed his name to at the bottom of the speeding ticket. It could have been worse, a lot worse, if Richard hadn't got a grip on himself by the time the officer reached the side of the Blazer. He was grateful that his practiced skills of control had helped him keep the conversation at an acceptable level. "Considering my mood," Richard snapped at himself, "I did rather well." "Here you go, Mr. Gaspar," the officer announced while handing back his copy of the ticket. "That baby will cost you a little," he added after pointing at the green piece of paper in Richard's hand. When Richard didn't respond, the officer added, "I know this little truck here is a rental and you're from out of town, but if you're still around next Wednesday and could stop by the town hall between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, you could take our Happy Driver Safety course. It'll save you $50. The officer smiled. Richard had a difficult time forcing a smile in return, yet replied as nicely as he could. "I'll think about it. Thank you." He was anxious to leave so he could reach Las Vegas in time to catch the first flight out that evening. The only thing stopping him was the officer's cue to exit. Richard Gaspar. Richard Gaspar. The officer tilted his hat to one side and began scratching his temple. "I know I've heard that name before. Are you related to anyone famous?" Richard closed his eyes and shook his head. What an idiot. "Have we met somewhere?" the officer commented while removing his sunglasses. Richard reluctantly opened his eyes and held still while the officer scrutinized his every feature. "I can't believe this," Richard thought while staring down the road with his hands clenched on the steering wheel. He was more impatient to leave than ever. The officer's eyes suddenly brightened and he stood back. "I've got it," he he exclaimed while dropping his sunglasses back into place. "I never forget a face. You're that violin player. My mother has a copy of your record, CD anyway, sitting right next to her stereo." The officer's tone took on an air of satisfaction. "I bet you just came from Sean Diego's place north of town so you could buy a real violin." He stood back, drew in his breath, and whistled while looking at the dust and dings around the bottom of the blazer. "Only by the look of your face as you drove by, and the amount of gravel you must have thrown between his place and Main Street, you probably couldn't afford one, huh? Is that it?" Richard made no reply. He just gave the officer a look of disgust and rolled his eyes. The officer continued in a sympathetic tone. "That happens a lot. That's too bad. How much did he ask? I hear they're getting pretty expensive." Richard didn't bother answering. His patience was growing thinner with each of the officer's words. "My daughter's learning how to play the cello. She says she would really like one of his instruments when she gets good enough. I don't know, though. Being a police officer doesn't pay much round here. Yet I've heard of him cutting deals if someone's good but can't afford one. You must make pretty good money living back east, huh? Did you ask him if he took payments? I heard, though, that he wouldn't. Susie should probably start saving up now. Do you play the cello, too? Do you give lessons?" "That's it! I can't take any more!" Richard almost blurted out loud. Richard's eyes flared at the officer. "He burned up my check!" "Ooh-wee!" exclaimed the officer while backing away. "Got to you, did he?" Richard had no desire to continue the conversation and felt like the officer was getting an unusual amount of pleasure out of his painful situation. "Wouldn't take your money, huh? What did you do? Insult his wife? Or step on her cat's tail? You must have really ticked him off if he wouldn't take your money." Richard didn't even look at the officer. "It wasn't my money. The violin was supposed to be a gift from a friend of mine. It was my friend's money." Richard's knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel. "Why am I talking to you about this anyway? Am I free to go or not?" "Ooh-wee!" the officer repeated. Then he leaned forward and ordered in a firm, low voice. "You aren't going anywhere, Mr. Gaspar. You aren't driving down my road until you simmer down. You see, that ticket's one thing, but I don't want you tearing up the pavement or plowing into any of these children while you're having this little tizzy fit of yours." The officer pointed toward the group of young children still playing in the water at the side of the road. Richard knew that he had blown it with the officer, so he just gave in. He pulled his hands off the steering wheel, sat back, and took a deep breath. "That's better," the officer commented. "So, he wouldn't take your friend's money, eh?" The officer traded his stern expression for a puzzled look. "I don't know what's up, unless your friend insulted Sean's wife or stepped on her cat's tail. But I'll tell you this. The people who come from his shop and drive down this street with an instrument of his in their car are never mean or ornery. I've seen them drive up, everyone in the car with scowls on their faces. But if they drive back down with one of his instruments in the car, it's always with a smile. Not everyone buys from him, though. And those people drive back down the street with the same ornery looks on their faces as when they came." The officer offered. "Tell you what, it looks like you could use about 15 minutes to simmer down, and I need a drink. Jump in the back of my car here and I'll buy you a grape soda up at the store." What could Richard say? He reluctantly stepped out of the Blazer and into the back seat of the police car. "Regulations, you know," the officer apologized. After the door was closed for Richard, he looked at his surroundings. First at the heavy steel screen separating him from the officer, then at the blatant lack of door handles and window cranks. Even though the day was hot and Richard was perspiring, a chill ran down his spine. He had only been in the back seat of a police car one other time in his life. He was 16 years old. Michelle was sitting right next to him, and it was a late September night.